Okay, I think we can get started about now. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm pleased to welcome you to this EPC hybrid policy dialogue titled Force of Nature, Investing in a Paris-Aligned Future. This event is held in collaboration with Apple. I'm Brooke, a policy analyst with the Sustainable Prosperity for Europe program here at EPC, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. I'll start with a very brief introduction to the discussion, and then we can get right into the speakers. So transitioning to net zero and keeping the Paris goals alive are crucial for averting climate change. Within this transition, nature plays a vital role, leveraging ecosystems to absorb and store carbon, while also offering co-benefits like biodiversity conservation and climate resilience. This importance is increasingly recognized, with UNEP, for instance, having highlighted the need for finance flows towards nature-based solutions to triple by the year 2030. As it stands, public funding alone is not able to sufficiently support these initiatives. And this is an issue only further complicated by the upcoming expiration of the Recovery and Resilience Facility and an MFF with unknown result. Private financial streams are incredibly important and offer a lot of opportunities. They also have their own challenges, whether it be the fact that a lot of these related EU legislative initiatives are yet to be fully implemented, or other challenges including the concern for greenwashing, with the 2022 expansion of the EU taxonomy regulation to include fossil gas as a green energy source. As the importance of private investment grows, it's critical to understand not only how investments can be scaled up and incentivized, but also to establish robust rules and standards to ensure integrity, accountability, transparency, and effective steps towards a Paris-aligned future. So, discussing this today, we have a panel of 5 speakers who I'll introduce now. We'll first be hearing from Tilman Murata-Liebert, Policy Officer of Sustainable Finance at DG Klima, Hiba Larsson, Principal and leads on nature investment activities at Nature Finance, Adeline Rochet, Program Manager for the Corporate Leaders Group of Europe, which is a business coalition active in climate and environment advocacy, convened by the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, Jane Thostrup Jagd, Director of Net Zero Finance with the We Mean Business Coalition, and Evelyn Underwood, Head of Program for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services at the Institute for European Environmental Policy, or the IEEP. So after our speakers give their key remarks, the floor will be open for Q&A from our audience. So for those of you online, please feel free to just write any questions you may have in the chat as we go along. And then for those of you in person, raise your hand at that time and we can bring you a microphone. So without further ado, I will pass the floor to our first speaker, Tilman. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Brooke, for the introduction, and to EPC for having me at this exciting and definitely very timely event. We're talking about investment. Of course, generally, think tank, policymaking world, we know policy impacts are difficult to quantify, but let's talk about some hard figures. Any idea among the audience here how much money there is in the world, specifically debt and equity investments globally? Any wild guess? Question isn't asked, I think, nearly enough. A trillion, 2, a quadrillion, a gazillion. Well, it's a good 200 trillion US dollars. And that's not even counting real estate assets. And let's compare that to the investment needs we have globally. Another reputable think tank, a climate policy initiative, sees the need to increase climate finance, both from public and private sources, from around US $1.3 trillion now to 6 to 12 trillion that are needed. And that's also in line with the IPCC's report last year that sees global mitigation investments expected to need to increase by the factor of 3 to 6. Zooming in on the EU, additional investment is less than or almost 500 billion per year needed just for energy supply and demand and road transport alone. And because we're not talking about climate only here today, a recent estimate also is at 110 billion euros for non-climate environmental objectives. So sure, I am at DG Klima, but we are not silos in the Commission. Clearly, climate and nature investments are synergetic, in particular regarding climate adaptation, where the finance gap is particularly high. So it's really about everything, everywhere, all at once, as Cambridge Institute for Sustainable Leadership aptly named their report last year presented at COP28 in the EU Pavilion. And in the next few minutes, I'll focus on the private side of the equation. While, of course, public funding is essential, global and EU policy frameworks and to ensure shifting what is in comparison a relatively modest share of total private capital needs will indeed make or break Paris Agreement alignment in the critical decades to come. Zoom in on 3 levers that this Commission has been pursuing, and of course, all that on the solid basis of the EU's Paris-aligned European climate law targets for 2030, 2050, and the now agreed Fit for 55 package of real economy policies to deliver that. So first, let's start at the global level. Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement is clear on the need to make, open quote, finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low emissions and climate resilient development, end quote. And this, of course, also covers finance at the climate-nature nexus. With the member states, the Commission has been vigorously engaged in the negotiations, aiming to ultimately mainstream climate into every economic and financial decision, domestically and globally, into national budgets and the development finance system. And a major milestone, though surely not the end of the road, was COP28 last year, where parties confirmed the urgency of action and emphasized the role of all actors, including private ones and the financial system. Building on that, in the negotiations, we're calling for the largest possible contributor base and contributions from all those that can afford it. And this is also something we pursue, of course, in other fora, G7, G20. Now to my second focus, the EU, where we have a well-developed sustainable finance framework. In other words, a framework that aims to redirect private capital to work for and not against the European climate law and broader European Green Deal as the EU's responsibility under the global targets. It consists of 2 main pillars. The first one to highlight the corporate sustainability reporting that is now in force, with reporting starting next year. Over time, it will cover all large and listed companies, more than 40,000 ultimately. It regards not just impact on companies, but in the sense of double materiality, impact by companies on sustainability. It's audited, has a driver of green competitiveness built in, and sets requirements, of course, not just on climate, but across the ES and G fields. Of particular importance for mobilizing climate finance are the climate transition plan reporting requirements to ensure that the business model and strategy are compatible with the transition, Paris Agreement, European climate law being referenced. And there's also a biodiversity transition plan related. So the standardized disclosures provide information to markets that they need to function effectively and deliver green investments on both the investor and investee sides, and has, of course, been calibrated for the least possible reporting burden. And the second pillar of the Sustainable Finance Framework, complementing the disclosures, are voluntary tools, namely the EU taxonomy that you mentioned, that is defining what green means for 6 environmental objectives, not just climate change mitigation, adaptation, also circular economy, water, pollution, biodiversity. And it's not just gas or nuclear, but by now 150 different economic activities across 16 economic sectors covered with different delegated acts under the regulation. Complementing and building on the taxonomy is the EU Green Bond Standard that can also be used internationally and will enter into force later this year, which is aligned with the EU taxonomy as to the use of proceeds permitted under that, And also to mention another tool, the climate benchmarks, Paris-aligned benchmark, climate transition benchmark, that by now has more than 120 billion euros invested in compliant ETFs. So this sustainable finance framework having a core objective of preventing greenwashing in finance, mobilizing transition finance. But let's look at greenwashing more broadly as the third area. And zooming in, and this may be or maybe not surprising for you, consumer protection, another file that I've been dealing with for DG Klima. And here back to figures. Any clue what total household consumption in the EU was last year? Total household consumption 2023 stood at almost 9 trillion euros just in 1 year. And we know that there's a considerable willingness to pay for green, but this is held back due to the mistrust based on the many misleading claims out there. And here's where another set of initiatives that are core to the European Green Deal come in, that enable consumers to make informed purchasing decisions, to boost competitiveness of companies that are genuinely green, preventing unfair competition. So, to put it differently, a huge potential to drive Paris-aligned investment decisions. And here one that is already agreed and in force since March is a directive on empowering consumers for the green transition through better protection against unfair practices and through better information, which essentially updates the existing long-standing and evolved consumer protection framework in the EU that was so far colorblind as to green, and helps promote the transition and circular economy. In complement, the other pillar, the Green Claims Directive, which is still in co-decision, for which the Commission proposal set out detailed requirement for the substantiation and communication of any and all explicit voluntary environmental claims made in the EU. And with that, to conclude, while surely there are many more levers that the EU, the Commission has been advancing over this past legislature, and of course, not to forget, definitely not an afterthought, the just transition dimension that is critical, that has to be ensured if the transition is to happen at all. But to conclude for now, international negotiations, sustainable finance policies, and the fight against greenwashing as three key complementary levers with great potential to drive Paris-aligned investments. So many thanks for your attention and for now, and look forward to hearing from the other panelists and to the exchange.
Thank you very much, Tillman. And I think part of this basis of the framework and maybe also the safeguards that are in place, and specifically with greenwashing, which is something I'm sure that we'll come across later in the discussion. And for now, we'll take it to Hiba online, actually, with more of providing now a shift to the role for private investments, specifically in the transition to net zero and remaining on track to achieve the Paris goals. So Hiba, thank you.
Thank you. I always find it really interesting to hear all of the stats to get some context. And I think it's a nice segue to the presentation that I have. But just briefly on Nature Finance, we're a Swiss not-for-profit organization, and our sole mission is to make nature more visible in financial markets. And we do that through a number of different modalities, so working with the central banking community, regulators and standard setters, but also MDBs and governments in terms of trying to find new ways of restructuring debt and debt targets to align with nature positive outcomes. And really, I mention nature here because we think it's all linked. So you can't really advance to a net zero economy unless you also account for nature, but also recognizing that in this transition, we also need to do it in a just way. So it's really a trilemma here that we're addressing. And I think there's numbers out there in terms of 55% of the GDP is dependent on nature and so on and so forth. But I think we can all recognize that 100% of our economy is in one way or the other dependent on nature. And what we think is that early stage investment could be a great way of catalyzing the rapid shifts to address some of the tools and solutions that are needed, because time is of essence here and we don't have much time. But also we need to think of the way in which we invest into nature, recognizing here that we need to be far more strategic in the way we allocate and reflect nature in our portfolios. And we need to have much more of a patient. We can't just look to the short term when investing. And I think what most of the audience would agree on is that we really need to radically change the way in which we account for nature in the financial system. And I think it goes well beyond just identifying the risks and sort of the impacts. It's to get this understanding for how nature flows through the whole system. And here it's really the web that we need to get together of policy making and the regulators, as well as the investments and capital. It's all linked. And in order to do so, we do need data, relevant analytical tools, but also more innovative instruments to ensure that we can take the right decisions and also get exposure to nature in the right way when we make investments. And I think to Tillman's earlier point, you mentioned the consumer sort of power. You gave the number there of the consumption in Europe, and that's really what we are seeing here. It's not just the policies, it's not just the regulations and standards, it's also citizens' perspectives that are increasingly changing. And we need to corral everyone to address the challenges that we are facing. See, I lost my slides here. Let's see. Having some technical issues here. Can you see that on the screen? Is it? No.
No, not yet, sorry.
Okay, that's all right. I give it another go, otherwise I'll just freelance. No. Okay. So, bear with me 2 seconds. Okay.
We can share the slides from our end if perhaps that's easier.
That would be very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, there you go.
Thank you. And I think, Tillman, you also mentioned, if we go back a slide, you go back a slide. So really what we're seeing here is a wave of new standards and regulations taking place. And this is really forcing corporates, investors, and other market actors to think about and consider nature, but also how it fits within the broader context of the net zero transition. And we think it's absolutely critical to have this, because otherwise we can't use the same language, if you like, in terms of what's needed when it comes to investment in nature, but also to understand how the capital flow into nature. And just to give you some examples, it's estimated that in the soft commodity space of food commodities, which is trading annually at around 8 trillion. That trade have negative externalities of 12 trillion. There are other estimates that the sort of negative nature flow from financial markets is around 7 trillion. So just by understanding how the financial capital flow and its impact on nature, and just by avoiding the damage we're making, could have significant impact, and it's in the realms of trillions. And just looking at the next slide here, because I think when people think about climate and nature, so I think when it comes to climate, it's much easier to think of transition in terms of clean tech and other investments. It's less obvious, I think, in nature beyond nature-based solutions. But as you will see on the next slide, one can really see how one can invest into nature across the capital stack. So here we can start with listed equities, for instance. There are a few emerging biodiversity funds, but it's also understanding how corporates operate and understanding their impact on nature. And here you have new initiatives like TNFD, which is the nature cousin, if you like, of TCFD, which will allow investors to get greater clarity and transparency in terms of how corporates are operating. And then there's a range of different ways of getting exposure to nature through bonds or private debt investments, and all the way through then to the more maybe adventurous side of the risk scale, which is venture capital. And here there's a range of new companies emerging when it comes to analytics tools or data tools, as well as other technologies that are more familiar, perhaps like controlled environment ag, which might not be the first first investment that people associate with nature, but it actually elevates the pressure on nature. So anything that has a nature positive outcome is clearly something that should be focused on. And I think what's important when looking at the stack is how do we encourage greater investment in this space? And I think it's very interesting to look at parallels with the climate space, because we saw in the clean tech space, for instance, it was a collaboration of governments who subsidized some of these technologies that really allowed institutions and others to invest at scale through de-risked offtake agreements, etc. And here it's critical, we believe, in the nature space that we come up with similar ways of approaching it to truly get the institutional capital at scale investing into nature. And we can just look at the last slide here. So we believe that in order to truly account for nature and markets, we really need to set new standards. We need to have the tools to understand how to measure nature and to understand what the pressures are when it comes to using the resources of nature. And we believe that there's an array of new companies emerging in this space, which we think are critical to support. Otherwise, we won't be able to monitor the performance or ensure or monitor the regulations that we are now seeing are put into force. So we think it's critical now to support these type of investment. And we believe by doing so, we'll hopefully get this new wave of investment opportunities, as we saw in the clean tech space, that will encourage sort of mainstream investments to enter into to nature markets. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hiba. And I think it's interesting to talk about the nature positivity or being nature positive, because in my mind that's something that comes to the forefront of this need to establish indicators, but also the ability to compare across variables and look at the whole picture. And I think hopefully it'll be something that we talk about later. And I think also these innovative investments you speak of and the need to have the tools to understand nature and support it will hopefully be a question we address in the Q&A. So I'll bring it on to our next speaker, Adeline Rochet with CLG Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. I do not have slides, so I hope that the audience is not too disappointed. But of course, all the numbers and information I'm going to use today are publicly available on our website in various publications. So I'm happy to share the reference later. And I was actually very impressed and learned a lot from the previous conversations with the previous speakers on not only on the numbers, but on the instrument and on what is it that is maybe missing from the framework currently to unlock massive investments in nature positive activities in operation, and not just nature-based solutions, which in themselves represent a large market opportunity, but more generally ensure that all the operations have a neutral or even positive impact on ecosystems and biodiversity. From a business case, it is clear that there is a lot of opportunities that are associated with investing in nature. There are numbers that have been put together, for instance, by the Commission in the impact assessment around the nature restoration law, where you can see how striking the cost of inaction is, which is estimated around 1,700 billion euros. The return on investment is estimated, difficult to estimate, but the numbers vary between 8 to 38 euros per euro invested, which of course make it kind of a no regret investment for companies. And globally, the impacts, the costs of extreme weather events are accelerating. It's been calculated by the European Environment Agency to be 650 billion since 1980, but it's been 50 billion euro in damage only for 2020 to 2023. So this is a clear trajectory that extreme weather events cost will only accelerate. And I'm bringing in the extreme weather events cost or climate change impact cost, because of course it is well known and established that this is one of the cases where investing in nature allows for climate adaptation, and it is something that companies see as increasingly important, because that's a way for them to secure their own assets and infrastructure, and as well as overall the infrastructures that they depend on. So if you take the example of the energy system, of course, all companies throughout Europe need to have access to energy. And if you have a storm that tears down all the power line, this is going to be a problem for companies. So also from that stability of operation perspective, it is an investment that makes sense for them. I do have some example from member companies who have invested in nature. I'm not going to draw everyone in numbers, but and also because I see that one of my colleagues from Velux just joined, and I was about to mention that Velux, for instance, has invested to capture 1 megaton of CO2 in Uganda through a reforestation project in partnership with WWF, which is to restore 34,000 hectares of forests, to show that some companies are already walking the talk and are already investing in tangible, measurable projects that have demonstrated impact. We have in CLG, in Corporate Leaders Group Europe, we have members who want to be at the forefront of the transition and at the forefront of the climate and nature positive action. And for them, it is important to have the regulation supporting that effort so that it's no longer a front-runner's effort, but that it is shared across the economy. Another example that I had in mind was how Unilever has committed to deforestation-free supply chain. They had a target of 100% in 2023. They've only managed to reach 97.3% deforestation-free supply chain at the end of 23, meaning that the 100% is really within reach. So it also shows that some very decisive action, strategic action from large companies can make a difference. And I'm mentioning Unilever because when you look at their activities and operations, they rely a lot on some crops, particularly palm oil, which is well known to be one of the big drivers of deforestation globally. So if a multinational company such as Unilever decides to divest away from palm oil supply chain that drive deforestation, this makes a difference globally. But here again, it is essential to have business leaders engaging in that direction, but it can only work for everyone if the policy globally follows. Europe is extremely advanced in that direction. It has to be global, it has to be multilateral, and it has to be brought in international forums. We have a biodiversity COP later this year, shortly before the climate COP. So there are some areas where Europe can bring global leadership and unlock positive action more globally. I also wanted to talk about food security, which is highly impacted by biodiversity loss and soil degradation. This is another area where the costs are huge. It's been estimated to be around 50 billion per year in Europe, again by the European Environment Agency. So this is another sector where investments are actually a way to prevent future costs down the line. This involves long-term planning, this involves long-term decision-making, and this is why businesses call for clear pathways and clear roadmaps, and the longer term the policy with identifiable milestones, the better it is for them to invest, because of course corporate leaders themselves depend on their own finances. So they can commit to a certain extent to private investments, but you need a whole finance ecosystem to be behind and to be willing to invest in that direction. I think it is excellent to have finance experts with us today, because I'm sure they can tell us a lot more about it, but this is also an area where the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership is engaged. It's to understand the nexus between sustainability and finance. What are the financing instruments? What are the financing recommendations? What is the nexus between climate, nature finance, and insurance, for instance, because of course this is a very big driver for institutional investors to know how much it's going to cost to cover for climate risk and for biodiversity risk. So it is another area where the more data you have, the better your decision making can be, because if you can estimate the future cost or the future cost of an action, that helps you make the case for investing today, rather than wait until the impact have become so huge that they are unmanageable. So maybe to conclude, I would say that roundtable like this one are much welcome, also because they allow to put together different pieces of the jigsaw, and it is essential that different sectors or different parts of the supply chain talk to one another to have integrated solution, because this is how you put together the framework that is needed to unlock systemic change. And I will stop there.
No, thank you very much, Adeline, for this business case. And I think this complements our next speaker quite well, who will also be expounding upon this and perhaps a few of the tools as well. And that will be Jane Thostrup Jagd with We Mean Business Coalition. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. My name is Jane Jagd, and I am from Net Zero, from Women Business within Net Zero Finance. I am here to provide you with a business perspective on private investments in nature. Next slide, please. The first I will touch upon will be, what is an investment? You might say that is very basic. It is basic, but I've heard many misunderstandings. So it's quite important to stress what is it and what is it not. Then we will touch upon EU taxonomy, which we also heard a bit about previously, but I will tell you a bit what can it actually be used for. And then we are to talk about carbon credits and VCMs. Next slide. The first topic is this: what is an investment? And the reason why I say this is because, especially within nature, and actually also just transition, very, very often the projects are not profitable. And then it's not an investment. Then it's philanthropy, and there is nothing wrong with philanthropy, but it's not an investment. So that is very important to stress. And the reason why I stress this is because those who are to provide the capital for this will be different depending on whether this project is profitable or not. So that is quite important. Banks, pension funds, and other regular private market actors, they will have very big difficulties participating in a philanthropy project. They have a fiduciary duty to maximize their profit. So it's not because they are evil. It is simply that's how it is. So merely for everybody to know, that is how it works. That's the bottom line of everything. Next line. EU taxonomy, which we heard a bit about before, is, as it was also indicated, actually very important when we talk about nature. Because EU taxonomy covers 6 environmental objectives, which I've included here. So apart from climate change mitigation and adaptation, which have been alive for a couple of years, we have actually also seen last year water, circular economy, and pollution and biodiversity kicking in for non-financial companies. And now this year will kick in for the financials. So it is on its way, and it will kick in, I promise you, but please be patient. It is a big ask of companies to report on the taxonomy, and some of them are good at it, some of them are not good at it, but it's very important. And what can it actually be used for? The taxonomy can actually make otherwise completely black companies, they can be able to raise capital to greenify parts of their company. And that's the main part of it. It can also be used for the entire company. Of course it can, but usually it's not a secret if a company is completely green. Most investors do know that. So what is important is actually to be able to identify stock projects within a company which is green. That is important. And that is possible. Let's assume you have an oil company who has an activity which they would like to greenify. Then what they can do is that they can issue green bonds according to the EU taxonomy, and thereby raise the capital they need to make that part of their company green. So that is important. Next slide, please. And as you can see here, it is increasing. It is positive, but it's not where we should be yet. No. Last year, we did an analysis of the 100 largest listed companies in EU, and we can see almost half of them, they actually issue green bonds. Not as many as we would like, definitely not, but they have already started, which is very promising. And we can also see almost all the financial companies, they work with green bonds in some ways. So it is there. It is being used. And we can see now the latest report I saw was from DZ Bank. They have made an overview of all the bonds issued. And they say around a quarter or so are green by now. Of course, it leaves room for improvement, but it is increasing, and it's actually very, very positive to see this. Next slide. Another thing that is often mentioned when we talk about nature is carbon credits. Carbon credits, especially in Europe, is a very mixed bag. We have actually also just finalized an analysis of the 30 early adopters of CSRD to see how do they report, because the CSRD also require that if you have if you use carbon credits, you also report on it. And we can see that some, around a third, but this is not statistically significant, but around a third, they say they use carbon credits. Around a third, or even more, say they definitely don't want to touch carbon credits. And then a third, not really mention it at all. So carbon credits are mixed. And I foresee, I must say, that it will continue to be a bit difficult in Europe. And I will show you in a moment why. I do know that especially in the US, and potentially also in Canada and other places, carbon credits will be much wider used. But currently we have some restrictions in the EU that makes it a bit more complicated. Next slide. It is so that within the ESRS E1-7, it is defined that you have to have verification against recognized quality standards. We don't know what that means, I can tell you. The problem is that the EU's carbon removals and carbon farming is only provisionally agreed to. And that means that we still have no certification methodologies, we have no liability mechanisms, and we have no EU-wide registry of these. That is a problem, of course. On top of this, we also have the issue of E1760, which indicates that the company itself will have to reduce everything into 90 to 95% on their own. And only after that can they then consider to use carbon credits. So that's a different game. We also know that many companies are working with science-based targets, and they currently at least also prohibit this. There is a discussion going on. I'm sure everybody has seen it. But so far, at least in EU, it is a bit more problematic to use carbon credits, regardless that they might actually, in the future, if we have all these fantastic new certification methodologies in place, it might actually be working well also for nature. Next slide, please. So actually, we were here in We Mean Business very, very happy when we earlier this week saw that the US government have announced that they will make some principles to use for voluntary carbon markets. And that will be important. And hopefully there could be a trickle-down effect for once from US to EU, because here it appears that they are faster than we potentially are. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I also saw that just in time for this discussion, they released that. But no, it's positive outlook for things and moving the market at a global scale. And thank you for this deeper look into specific tools. And we'll now be going on to our final speaker, Evelyn Underwood. I would just like to say that as this is our last speaker, after this, we will be opening the floor for Q&A from our audience. So get your questions ready, and then you'll have the opportunity to ask them then. So Evelyn, I pass the floor to you.
Thank you. And yeah, so I'll just say next slide. The next slide comes. So pleased to see you. I'm here from the Institute for European Environmental Policy, as you heard. Grand name. We're a small sustainability think tank. So my job here on this panel, the clicker, is to challenge the other speakers from the perspective of civil society. Now, we don't really represent civil society, but as think tanks, we are independent researchers, and we have a mission to educate, inform, and advise on environmental policy in the EU. Personally, I'm a biologist. I'm not a finance expert, so I'm going to play to my strengths today. And the first point will be that I am misusing the word investment in my slides. So please read funding when you read investment there. So very briefly, I will also address the questions. So why should we invest in nature? And how much are we actually investing? And then the key point, what are the challenges and risks as perceived from the point of the public with private investment in biodiversity, and some key elements that need to be put in place to get effective, positive private funding for biodiversity. So where should we invest? We've had some strong arguments here, some big numbers already, so I'll be really brief here. But the key point is that biodiversity loss and climate change are completely interdependent. We need both. We need to tackle both at the same time. Biodiversity loss is exacerbated by climate change. It also makes the impacts of climate change much worse. So that means we need solutions that are going to tackle climate change and restore our biodiversity at the same time. At the same time, we have an urgent need to increase the resilience of our society and our economy in Europe and with the continent that's most affected. It will be, in reality, impossible to achieve the EU's 2050 climate targets without greatly increasing the amount of carbon that we store in our land and in our seas. And it's becoming increasingly clear that the capacity of our ecosystems to capture carbon is decreasing. So not only do we need to reverse that decline, but we need to restore capacity. So there are big challenges. And climate events, of course, are becoming more frequent. So a forest fire, a drought, or a flood will very quickly destroy the carbon that you've put a lot of effort into restoring over decades. And not least, restoring nature, as we heard, has very significant benefits for our society, our well-being, our economy. And the cost of inaction is enormous. So, very briefly, are we investing enough? I'm not going to throw any more numbers at you. So just to say that the impact assessment of the EU Nature Conservation Law proposal came up with a figure of at least 8 to 9 billion a year. And this appears a very modest number compared to what you've heard and is likely to be an underestimate because you would need to have at least that much again to ensure the protection of the biodiversity we already have. And there are some aspects that are just impossible to quantify at the moment. So marine restoration is very difficult to put numbers on that really stand up to scrutiny. And in our cities, you can come up with impossibly large numbers if you want to try to estimate the costs of recreating more green space in our cities. So it doesn't, to a certain extent, doesn't really make sense. So the point that I will just make is that at the moment, public funding is what dominates in restoration. It's also what is kind of easier to measure in a way. But it's also very clear that public budgets are no way going to be enough. So we really need to have a significant upscaling of private funding to meet the needs. And the business sector overall has been very positive, as pointed out by Adeline, to the EU nature restoration proposal and the other initiatives, because it provides the business environment with these clear targets and a clear legislative framework. At the same time, though, a lot of this nature restoration will have to happen on our farmland, in our forests, and on our seas. And these are the farmers, the foresters, and the fishers who are delivering this. Now, they are also businesses, but at a very different scale most of the time. Very varied, obviously. But the benefits are public goods. They're not bringing revenue back to those who are doing the restoration. And this is the big challenge. So to point out some of the challenges and risks that are perceived from the public side of the public society. So it goes back to what the previous speaker mentioned about carbon markets. There's this lack of established and accepted monitoring, reporting, and verification mechanisms. And part of this is the biodiversity credits market is still very small. The regulatory framework is just in its inception now. But there is a risk that the lack of public trust in the voluntary carbon market could also spill over to the biodiversity credits market. So there's a need to establish more transparency and to ensure public participation. And that's not easy because it needs time and it needs resources from the part of the civil society to come in here, and it needs an identification of a third party who verifies individual investments, but also a role for government to provide an overall oversight of the process. And a big fear from the environmental sector point of view is that a lot of this is hiding and undermining of the mitigation hierarchy. And by that, we mean that it's enabling the causes of biodiversity loss to put less attention on avoiding that loss and changing systems to avoid the loss in the first place by compensating for it in investing in offsets. So that's just one aspect of the biodiversity financing horizon, as you saw in previous slides, but it's about offsetting in particular. And as the European Environment Agency has recently pointed out, there is overall still a systemic mispricing of biodiversity risk in the financial sector. So there's a great need for better, more accurate and embedded estimates of biodiversity risk that will then play out into the financial instruments. A key point I'd like to just make here quickly, as I am a biologist, is that biodiversity is not the same as carbon. So carbon, a unit of greenhouse gas that goes into the atmosphere, is something that you can measure and you can use as a unit wherever you go. Biodiversity is complicated. It's site specific. If you restore a piece, even if you can come up with a unit for biodiversity, which is already something that biologists can argue about for days and days. Even if you could do that, it would not be the same in the different places that you do it. So if it's in the middle of a species range or at the edge, if it's in a very degraded area, the effects are very, very dependent on many factors. So if you're setting up, to go to my last slide, to come to the conclusions, this need to establish a framework whereby you can measure, monitor and verify the impacts of what you are funding or investing in. You need a unit, you need a way of measuring, but as I said, it's practically, well, you can come up with very simplified systems, but really you are not reflecting then the real impact, and you're not really reflecting the real loss that you are measuring. So whatever you do has to be quite specific, and there's always a balance, because if you come up with a very specific system, it becomes unmanageable for most but the very biggest companies to deal with, or the biggest players. You need to have, therefore, a basic system, an intermediate system, and a more demanding system, depending on the volume of the investment, reflecting the reality, the estimated severity of the biodiversity loss that you're looking at. And you need ways to manage the uncertainty that you're dealing with, because biodiversity and restoration are uncertain processes. You never really know whether it's going to get right. You're dealing with a changing baseline, because climate change is messing with what you're trying to do the whole time. And you need to set safeguards. So some of that might be about basic rules, so positive requirements and negative requirements, using native species, for example. And it's also about allowing this scrutiny by civil society actors, by environmental experts, to ensure that the best information is being used, and that there is this sort of watchdog allowance of these players. And there is a very significant and increasing need for really good biodiversity data. And as we heard, this is already a market that's generating a lot of exciting innovations and opportunities for SMEs. And there's a lot of progress going on, but there are still also significant challenges to the data that's available, even in the EU, where I think we have the best biodiversity data, or one of the best continent-wide access to data on the condition of our biodiversity. I will stop there because that's a lot of points already, and I really look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Evelyn, in providing this input from a subject perspective and keeping in mind, this is about how we can avert climate change. So thank you. And the floor is now open to Q&A. So while I give you all a chance to prepare the many, many questions I'm sure you have, I'm going to go forth with one question I have, and I'd actually like to go back to you, Jane. In your intervention, you made the strong point that investment is not aid and not to conflate the two. And so this is something I'd like to unpack just a bit more, and understanding that investments will likely flow to where businesses have a stake, have an interest, or where perhaps money can be made. How can the EU ensure a variety of necessary projects are being financed? And perhaps given Adeline's interjection, maybe this is a non-issue, given the business case for a variety of topics we've discussed today. But and then perhaps more broadly, what are the challenges that arise when considering the fact that investments cannot take the place of aid? And what does this mean for the tools at hand? So thank you.
I don't think you can change the purpose of banks and pension funds. So that is what it is. What can happen is that you make projects which are more directly linked with companies' purpose, and then you have the opportunity to make them invest in it. The thing is also that sometimes they do not have the scale, these projects, so that they can actually turn into bankable projects because they're too small. And in those cases, it might actually be helpful if there were some platforms where smaller companies can go together and perhaps together issue bonds or other funding mechanisms that can actually be helpful for them. But in many cases, that is often the issue, that the projects are too small and not profitable.
All right, thank you. And I'll open the floor and see if we have any questions. Yeah, please. We'll bring you a microphone.
Hello, everybody. Yeah, I think it works. Jouni Nissinen from the Finnish Permanent Representation to the EU. In no way I'm representing the official views of my representation with my questions. I'm also new to this discussion, so I'm sorry if I ask things which are self-evident to everyone else. But I would have one question to Ms. Larsson. I think you said in your presentation that all the markets rely on nature. I think that's kind of okay. It's kind of clear what what you mean with it, but then I think that's kind of a loose argument, because then you also might end up thinking that, okay, because crude oil also comes from the nature, so the whole fossil market is also based on nature, and so fossil fuel market is also nature-based, part of nature-based economies. So maybe that should be somehow clarified more. And then one question maybe to Ms. Underwood or to everybody. I would, because I don't know how it works. So is there a concrete example of biodiversity market or biodiversity credit market somewhere? Like, that's something I would have liked to see. Thank you.
Yeah. I think it's such a great reflection. Thank you. I think what I was trying to illustrate is nature is not an infinite resource, it's an asset. And we will be able to generate the same level of GDP and GDP growth if we don't harness and regenerate that asset. And so by depleting this asset, we're putting our economies at risk. And so that's the point I was trying to illustrate. And I think for me, it's similar to just before GFC, where we had a bit of a Minsky moment where we weren't really valuing the risks, credit risks in our portfolios. And I think we're facing a similar moment here in time where we're not valuing nature at all in markets. And so I think that the profits we're seeing are not real profits. And I'm sorry if I'm sounding too radical, but I think there's so much risk in the financial system by not valuing nature properly. And I don't think we can rely on certain business models or even the way by which they source within their supply chains, etc., without accounting for nature. So it's just not viable. And then when it comes to biodiversity credit markets, so the credit markets themselves are fairly nascent and emerging, but we're seeing in the UK, for instance, they have the net biodiversity gain enacted, and you have a few compliance markets for biodiversity, including Colombia, for instance. You're seeing initiatives in Australia. And I'll refer to the experts on the panel on biodiversity. But really, what many people aren't familiar with is that the whole biodiversity compensation market it's several billions. So it's around, I think, estimates from memory between 7 to 10 billion in the US and elsewhere. So the compensation for biodiversity is well established. And we're seeing signs through regulation and other initiatives globally that this will continue to grow. But I'll hand over to the experts on the panel.
Thank you. It's actually very welcome that you illustrate what's going on in other parts of the world, because this is not something that the EU is a forerunner in. But there are some interesting voluntary initiatives that have actually managed to sell credits recently. There's one in Sweden and one in Germany. So I'm just trying to find the actual names for you. The one in Sweden is a forest company together with the Swedish university, the SLU, sorry, the Swedish Land University. The one in Germany is set up by an NGO. They are, of course, is a very small and essentially philanthropic initiatives, but still it shows what is possible to do. And the a more established one that you might have heard of is one called More Futures in Germany, which are combined carbon and biodiversity credits associated with peatland rewetting and restoration in northern Germany. And they've been going for a while now, and they've sold quite a lot more credits.
Well, I might have a follow-up question to this, and it's more, how can we channel more private investments then towards these biodiversity credit markets? Perhaps, Hiba, you could come in quickly and then change it back to our other speakers.
Yeah, so I think it comes down to similar to what we see in the sort of climate space. So I would be greatly encouraged if it was actually included in lending portfolios, for instance, because it poses such a significant risk to companies. And so if biodiversity was a consideration in lending, for instance, I think one would create this sort of natural awareness and flow to biodiversity investment. And also noting that there's a number of global players now who are established biodiversity asset managers, if you like. And I think that provides the methodologies and metrics to be adopted at scale by others. So I think it's hugely important that there's international cooperation when it comes to this, because to an earlier point made on the panel, it's harder and more complex to measure biodiversity outcomes. And by having these projects on the ground live and being able to measure their performance over time, one can sort of validate concepts and methodologies and then apply them at scale. And this is something work we do with MDBs and others. And we're also looking at how to include it in sovereign debt, for instance. So how can you link sort of nature positive outcomes to debt payments, etc. So I do think there's a strong linkage between biodiversity debts, but also through disclosure, because that's the only way, I think, to encourage companies to act.
Thank you. And I don't think we have any audience questions, so I'm going to also, to our speakers, please also feel free to come in at any time. Simply just indicate to me if you'd like to speak. Yeah, please take the floor.
Yeah, gladly to come into this very interesting set of presentation and discussion also afterwards. I'd like to come back to one aspect that's very core to what I presented earlier, but I didn't have time to touch upon, but seems quite topical, indeed, carbon credits and also potential lessons learned for biodiversity credits. So I think what is important to keep in mind and what differentiates also actors in this space, are carbon credits an end in themselves? Is it just about quantity, or are they a means to an end? Is it about quality? And indeed, as Evelyn mentioned, we shouldn't forget about the mitigation hierarchy. And this is core and built in to the instruments I mentioned, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and the ESRS E17 in particular. Require, of course, it's about transparency, requires disclosure in case carbon credits are used. And it has to be explained indeed how those are based on what are commonly accepted principles for carbon credit integrity, those recognized quality standards. Of course, such a reporting standards wouldn't enumerate what such standards are. And again, it's about transparency. You have to say you follow, you buy credits from program X, Y, Z, and then it's for the informed reader. The main target audience is investors, but also any other stakeholders, but surely not average citizens' bedtime reading, even if some sustainability reports can be interesting, but I might be in a minority there. To make up their own opinion, are companies regarding their climate performance, and particularly regarding, in this case, their carbon credit use, are they fulfilling the expectations that the reader has towards them? And indeed, there is not a requirement, but Jane mentioned this net zero target, which very clearly defines, and this is based indeed, the expert group that recommended this to the Commission based themselves on SBTi, the 90 to 95% own emission reduction before a company can claim to have met their net zero target, and only if they have addressed the residual emissions after this reduction percentage through permanent carbon removals. And that differs from current market practice significantly. And what is important to keep in mind is that while that's very restrictive on the use of carbon credits, what does reflect current practice, but while ensuring quality, is the complementary counterpart that wasn't mentioned earlier, which are greenhouse gas neutrality claims. And here, companies have to again show what are the carbon credits they use based on those recognized quality standards, and also how the use of those credits does not impede the meeting of their established greenhouse gas mitigation target that they've set up. So it does provide clear regulatory framework for the use of carbon credits and transparency thereon. And I mentioned transparency because then complementary for not the informed investor or stakeholder reading the report, but for any and all claim that companies make, and that's the scope of the Green Claims Directive. That is about also claims, of course, based on carbon credits or increasingly biodiversity credits. So that is fully under scope and will, according to the Commission proposal, we have to see, of course, what the co-legislators agree on, subject to pre-verification before that claim is made, whether that claim is well substantiated. And that will then also be addressed in detail regarding carbon credits. So again, high-level principles are mentioned in the Commission proposal, the usual suspects, additionality, permanence, no double counting, etc., and thereby set a very clear regulatory framework. And this is coming up, but what we have already and has made quite some waves, the Empowering Consumers Directive, which bans the use of carbon credits for the product level. So you will not see, as of late 2026, any carbon neutral bananas, milk cartons, or flights in the EU, anymore, because the co-legislators decided there that the use of carbon credits should be limited to the company level, and again, not in detriment of their own emission reductions. And then for a subset of all carbon credits, we have the carbon removal certification framework, which is fully agreed and adopted as regards the regulation, which again sets these high-level quality criteria for credits. The methodologies are outstanding for the specific types of units, but will of course be essential, even if it's a subset only of the market, mainly about removal credits, to reach the neutrality in carbon neutrality for 2050. And so we, of course, saw with interest the US joint statement on voluntary carbon markets and welcome that. But it is what it is. It is a voluntary statement for the VCM, positive signal, because what they integrated is fully aligned with the G7 principles that the EU was also heavily involved in shaping last year, the principles for integrity in carbon markets. And I would those specifically beg to differ that the US would be more advanced in regulating carbon markets, as I hope I've made clear through this set of initiatives on the CSRD, Empowering Consumers, CRCF, all agreed, and the upcoming Green Claims Directive. And the intention is implicitly or explicitly also indeed not just to fight greenwashing, but through quality, by ensuring quality of credits, to also have more quantity and thereby mobilize finance. And regarding biodiversity credits, I'm no expert, but I would very much hope that this nascent market could learn from experiences and indeed this lack of integrity, which is why it was interesting to hear that of this sample, 1/3 of companies said they're not touching carbon credits with a stick, even because indeed green hushing, the backlash in voluntary carbon markets. And we have to, with all the figures we've heard today, we have to also realize that the VCM is stagnating over the last few years at about $2 billion US dollars globally, so very, very limited. And the hope is that not just quality, but indeed, not just quantity, but indeed integrity, quality would then help also increase this market, contributing, underpinning the achievement of global climate targets.
Thank you. I wanted maybe to come back to an earlier point, but it's very interesting to hear your thought on the carbon credit market and the potential biodiversity credit system. So I wanted to take a step back because I think one of the questions was also how to unlock the private sector investments. And I think, well, there could also be a discussion on how the private and public finance interact and how public instrument can leverage private investment. But the other point I wanted to make was more on accountability and the fact that what you are saying on green claims, on greenwashing, on how robust are the carbon removal mechanism robust enough or not, it raised the question of accountability of the actors who are performing this. And there is, for instance, this initiative organized by Business for Nature that is called It's Now for Nature, where they lay down the principle for nature positive strategies for companies. And the 4 principles or the 4 pillars are assessing, committing, transforming, and disclosing. And I think that disclosing is the overarching sort of pillar, because if you have too many initiatives that are either voluntary only or open to loopholes, that means that you undermine the credibility in climate and nature actions, which means that you lower the level of commitment of actors in the future. That means that you undermine the trust of citizens and consumers in the products and services that would be the most beneficial. That means that in a sense the competition is not even, because there is this lack of trust. And I think that the private actors who invest now in climate neutral, nature positive operation services productions, they also do it because they have a high awareness of their own social license to operate, and they don't want to lose it. There's been example in history of company slowly falling behind because they had, if you take the example of sweatshops, it was a huge reputational damage to companies who were accused of producing their garments in terrible social conditions. I think that for a company, and I'm talking more about multinational or very big companies, of course, but for a company to have that trust for the consumers, to have that leading position on the market, to have that capacity to operate globally, it is more and more important to be accountable of their practices, to be accountable of how they are contributing to a greater good and to restoring that common assets, as you nicely put it together, that are planetary resources. But it is something that is, and I'm going back to my points, that is something that also requires some common set of rules and predictability and clarity of the rules, how to implement them and how to play the game fairly and not otherwise it falls into the unfair competition practices, but then that's an unfair competition that is detrimental to everyone.
Thank you. And something that you touched upon that I do think would be good to get into is this relationship between public and private. Thank you. So Jane, if that's something that you think you'd be able to speak to, just the relationship between private, public, and then maybe we could go back as well.
I don't have any statistics with me on that, but of course that is something that happens from time to time. It will still have to be profitable. If you have to, for instance, some of the projects we see are between pension funds and the public, and they are most often related to energy, because it's very mature and it's easy to measure, and it's that's something you fairly easily can do. So the issue is very often, as also some of you have indicated, nature is difficult to measure. And before we have a more mature way of measuring it, it will be difficult to actually claim that this will have this impact, because we don't know. We cannot validate it. We cannot make an auditor sign that that really happened. And so if we can get some clearer, more mature indicators for that, that would be really helpful. And now I also recall, I think it was you, Hiba, who mentioned TNFD earlier. I think the auditors have something to do here, because they have probably forgotten that already in the financial rules, it is so that if you have a threat against you, for instance, if you're a jam producer and you can sue, you have no bees, that means you will have no berries to make jam against them. Then you probably have an issue. You have a going concern issue that you should consider, and that will have a direct financial impact already with the rules we have today. The thing is, we don't need more rules. What we need is implementation. It's probably also a matter of being clearer. The TNFD, regardless that I like the initiative, it was not very clear on which exactly regulations part of IFRS or US GAAP that should be considered. And that would be a really, really good sub-project for TNFD to identify the exact rules that should be considered when you consider nature issues. That I think is important. Also for the auditors to be able to do it, because this may not be their home turf.
But I'd like to give you the floor to respond to that, and maybe also this question of implementation, given your experience.
Yes, I do think that it's a great point. I love the going concern analogy. I might use that in other presentations, because I think you're absolutely right. I do think what TNFD brings together is actually a common framework for measuring and understanding nature, because I think corporates now and financial institutions, many of them don't even know where to start. So it's just a hand-holding process, if you like, to provide that level of clarity. And I think from there, the implementation will be critical. But I think we're yet to sort of corral the market to get an understanding for the baseline. And I think that's critical to establish. And then from there, set targets to know how to measure those outcomes and how to measure the improvements. But maybe I'm too deeply involved, because I'm very encouraged by what I see in terms of measuring nature. There are initiatives like the ETH University and their Crowther Lab, who have established a very sophisticated way of measuring nature. You also have the company Nature Alpha, which has a platform that allows financial institutions to measure their nature impact and footprint across a number of different data sets. So I'm very encouraged by the frameworks now available and the technology and tools that are emerging. So I think one can be fairly optimistic in terms of the implementation. I do think, though, that regulation is required to really press corporates and the financial sector to really start disclosing their nature impact.
A question I have when we're speaking about this is scoping out perhaps a bit, and Evelyn, this would be a question to you, is what is the risk of, are we at risk of financializing nature, and what does that look like, and what are the risks there perhaps?
There are lots of risks here, because it's almost impossible to really capture the value of biodiversity in finance. And of course, even when you do that, you end up materializing it into very sort of economic focused values, and you ignore the other components of the value of biodiversity for our society. And that's a lot of what people will react to and care about. So they will think about it in terms of, in spiritual terms, in well-being terms, and you will get that pushback to this monetization of nature. On the other hand, no, I've just forgotten the other point I was going to make. On the other hand, yes, exactly. The costs, the same applies to the costs of inaction, but there the figures are so large that you have to say, well, you know, we need to move forward here, even if these numbers that we come up with don't really reflect the value of biodiversity. Sorry, I forgot the other point. The other point was about another sort of perception, public perception that plays a role when you're talking about credits that are associated with a biodiversity loss from development. So this is biodiversity offsetting, basically. And an important factor that plays a role here often is that when it's a development that is a visible thing, so a building or something that is, you know, on the ground in a village or a town with a local population, that local population wants to see that biodiversity offset close to them. So they don't want to see an investment in an exciting nature restoration project across the country or in another country, even if it's actually producing amazing results for biodiversity. They want to see the company investing in something that is close to them. So you end up most of the time with these biodiversity offsets being quite small pieces of land that are within the reach of the local authority that in which the development is taking place.
I think relatedly, you had mentioned the topic of climate adaptation. So I'd like to give you the floor maybe as a response to this as what's been discussed, and maybe also go back to the point of public versus private finance as well.
You're asking me, right? I don't know where to start on climate adaptation, because I think this is one of the topics that is likely to keep a lot of people busy during the next 5 years, if not more. Indeed, we know that there are accelerated impacts of climate change to be preparing ourselves against, and we know that investing in nature restoration or nature or ecosystem health and nature-based solutions is the best way to act on climate mitigation and adaptation all at once. And of course, in terms of market opportunities, this is huge, because this is something where there are, and it is in a sense very local, to also echo Evelyn's points, that when you have climate adaptation projects, you can't do it. It has to be very close to a given landscape, a given ecosystem, a given territory. So it also has great benefits in engaging local communities behind, because usually it's local jobs. It's so that's. For instance, I remember seeing a lot of the work that has been done after the floods around Liège, and the entire project of redesigning the valley was deeply involving local communities, meaning that they can see the progress made, they can see how it benefits them on a daily basis, and how it improves overall life quality and well-being, and has positive impact on wealth. So in that case, you're not talking about big numbers or cost of inaction or whatever, but it is people concretely seeing the benefits of investing in climate adaptation and restoration with a positive outcome on their daily life. So I think also in that regard, it is very important for SMEs. In the Corporate Leaders Group, we don't have SMEs with us, but we try and engage with SMEs representative as much as we can, because of course it is also an ecosystem in a sense. So you really want all the economic actors to be coming together, and then linking back to the role of public finance in something like that. And maybe to your point, Jane, on when is an investment philanthropy rather than an investment, and this is where public finance can close the gap, and this is where public finance can change the the time of return, meaning that a lot of investors, of course, are focused on long-term, on short-term profits, and the private sector too often has very short deadlines in mind. And that's where the public authority have a role to bridge that gap, to expand the expected return periods, to expand the visibility of what will be the outcome of a project. So there, having not necessarily subsidies, but also guarantees and loans, etc., that allows you to see the profits generated within the next 15, 20, 30 years, which of course is a very different conversation when you talk about small-scale project or very patient investments as well. So this is where this has to be designed with that interaction in mind, and not investment at loss, but investment with a clear idea of expanding the life cycle of a given project, expanding the definition of the benefits, because that also touches upon the indicators that you are looking at. If you're only looking at monetary return, or if you're also looking at health impact, which also have an impact on public budgets. If you don't have, I'm thinking, for instance, about air quality projects or air quality investment in several geographies, then if you really consider how you can lift the burden on public budget because you have invested in greening the city, then that's a climate adaptation, climate mitigation, and public health return. In that case, for the public authority, that may be a case for teaming up with local actors and investing in that.
Thank you. And I'll give the floor to you, Tillman, to come into that.
Yeah, so many interesting points to react to. I'd like to zoom in exactly on this challenge of financing, in particular, climate adaptation projects, because there is indeed often lacking business case. It's about oftentimes public goods, infrastructures that are at risk or already detrimented in. But also the case goes more broadly for sustainability investments. And of course, to make investment decisions, it might seem obvious, but still relevant to recall, one needs data. Companies, investors, they base decisions on data to take rational decisions, including on whether something is an investment or not. So, and underlying Jane's point that if there's no business case, there is, then no investment. That very question, of course, depends on availability of data, and those that would then inside corporations, financial or not, make investment decisions, or from the outside stakeholders exerting pressure, having expectations. And this is where we expect that moving beyond the leaders, the voluntary action that has been great on sustainability disclosures, definitely not limited to climate over the last years, now elevating that in the EU, and there's also international standards with which the CSRD is interoperable with, brings that to another level by making it mandatory, providing the level playing field between actors, not just for the leaders, and ultimately will drive also competitiveness, because if we look at the growth markets, not just the demand for from consumers for more sustainable products, or the need to invest into adaptation to fulfill targets, all that is also surely a competitiveness driver, not least by countering also the cost of inaction and the harmful investments, shifting those brown investments into transition ultimately into a green. And of course, at least in this room, it will be obvious that this is core to the European Green Deal that we've been operating under as Europe's growth strategy. And we don't know what exactly will happen in the next political cycle. That's to be decided, but it seems quite certain that competitiveness and thereby the importance of having sustainability data will continue to be important going into the next political cycle.
Thank you. One day we'll get it. Being conscientious of time, I'm going to give now each speaker an opportunity to go to any final remarks, but we'll end with a final remark, and I'll ask a final question. And I'll ask that we go around in the reverse order that we spoke, switch it up a bit. So that means we would starting with Evelyn and then ending with Tillman. But I'm just curious, and we've talked a lot about the EU and scoping out a bit, which we began to touch upon, but how can the EU, as we're seeing progress in these innovative tools, as we're seeing progress in regulation, voluntary, et cetera, how can the EU better leverage these to expedite better integration of nature into markets globally and enhance global collaboration on net zero? So thank you.
So there's a lot of exciting stuff going on, as we've heard. There are a lot of research projects going on this. We happen to be involved in several, but there are many more. So as we heard, there are many people setting up very useful tools and methods for biodiversity footprinting, for natural capital accounting, for companies to measure their biodiversity impact. And this will provide a really a momentum going forward that will be very positive, even though one of the main moves at the EU legislative level, the nature restoration framework, has got rather stuck in the political process. We do hope it will still go through, but there's some resistance there. So I'm very excited too, I have to say, as to what will develop in these years. And we still really need, though, the strong EU legislative framework for biodiversity that still relies on the two laws that were part of the first EU environmental legislation ever in the European Union. So that's the EU Habitats Directive that dates back to 1992 and the EU Birds Directive that dates back to 1979. And they still form the core of biodiversity protection in the EU, and they are also the generators of most of the biggest biodiversity data set EU-wide that is still the one that's relied on for a great deal of analysis that's done by the Commission and the European Environmental Agency and others. And that's where we're focusing our efforts, and where there's a great need for greater harmonization and cooperation between member states and other actors, including the private sector, to make sure that that is really delivering in a much more effective way. And that is sort of useful also to support biodiversity action by everybody, not just nature conservation departments of environment ministries.
Thank you very much, Evelyn, for this final introduction. And next we'll go to Jane, again for final intervention on the question, but also feel free to come in on any other remarks you'd like to make.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think I have three remarks. The first would be on behalf of all companies, please no more rules. We have gotten so many rules right now that have not even kicked in yet. So please, what we need is guidelines. Would be helpful. There are so many rules coming now. It's a tsunami of rules, and the companies would just like to be able to do it good, to be good at it. That would be really helpful. So more guidelines, no more rules. And then I would like to say, regarding the taxonomy, the technical screening criteria for the last 4 objectives are often fairly generic, to put it mildly. And it would perhaps be better if they were clarified, if they were enhanced, so that they support, for instance, biodiversity in better ways. So that will not require new rules. That will just require that the existing ones are clarified, are fine-tuned, are made better. That, I think, will be enormously important.
Right. Thank you. And I'll pass the floor now to Adeline.
Sorry. Yes, I would. I don't know if I entirely share the message on number of rules, because I think something like the taxonomy is a helpful guidance, even though you can question the entire content, but it's not yet been transposed into a norm. It is for now. It is let's say a standard, but it's not a. So I would maybe think that, but it's not convention. I mean, I don't want to open a new debate. It's just to say that maybe there are some rules to complement or to clarify or to strengthen that could be helpful also for companies to have a clearer sense of direction, because sometimes there are also inconsistency between different sets of rules that would be welcome to be a bit better aligned or clarified. But in general, to the question of how can Europe leverage globally the efforts towards more investment toward climate and nature, I would say, in responding 3 different dimensions. The first would be, well, of course, the Europe as a global norm generator or norm definer, and that there is a number of rules that are already existing, about to be implemented, or already implemented in Europe, that of course have an impact on other actors globally. Because that's my second point. Europe is also a huge market, so of course a lot of actors have to comply with European rules, and once they have complied with European rules, they may as well comply in other geographies as well. So Europe is also a big economy. Europe has actors who themselves can replicate the same practices in their operation services externally, and sometimes do. So this is also a way to export best practices in a sense. And finally, I would say, and also Europe as an economic actor itself, because Europe has a huge procurement capacity. So if you have, depending on what the public procurement rules in Europe are, that can also be a huge driver for companies also outside of the EU to increase their own investments to comply with European rules. And yeah, and finally, Europe has also a long track record of climate diplomacy that can be, of course, replicated in other area. And I think that Europe was fairly active in the biodiversity COPs. So that diplomatic capacity and knowledge and existing network of Europe, of course, can be mobilized in that direction.
And thank you very much. And I don't think Hiba is with us any longer. No, okay. So I'll give the floor to Tillman, and I also would add on to this that it would be nice to hear your opinion or your take on this question of regulation versus guidelines, especially in whether or not these softer policies have the teeth maybe necessary to ensure that we avert climate change and realize these goals. So thank you.
Thanks. Happy to give some closing thoughts, especially on the global perspective, what's needed for net zero. I made the point in opening that while the financing gap is large, it is relatively small compared to finance that is out there. I've outlined some powerful initiatives, levers, in a broader context. Sure, you could have gone more into detail on something that you touched upon, Adeline, on blended finance and how multilateral development banks, EIB, for instance, is quite exemplary. in this space, what could happen or what more could happen there. I think it's important to surely not focus just on the 7% if we think of climate, but the 93% of global emissions that are by now a non-EU. And indeed, here key instruments are climate diplomacy that we are exploiting in full in multilateral, plurilateral, bilateral processes, but also dedicated structures. You might have heard of the International Platform on Sustainable Finance, which has been instrumental. By now, its members covering a good 80% of population and emissions and economic activity worldwide. And that is not surely fully ascribable to the platform, but that where there are now more than 50 taxonomies globally, surely also has to do with work that has been going on there. And importantly, internationally, to take into account, to consider that by showing through the European climate law, through the legislation under the European Green Deal, that a framework that provides indeed this certainty and predictability while being conducive to competitiveness and growth, decoupling from negative impacts, that this is a viable model. And for third countries to see if that is also something they can pursue within their own specific context. And surely we know in the current geopolitical context that clean tech, for instance, is a key issue around competitiveness. And definitely also happy to come in closing regarding the challenge that this framework that has been established, specifically on reporting, but also other aspects represents for companies. It means putting in place new business processes for reporting, collecting data. So there is a kind of transition cost there that we are surely fully aware of. And that's also why we've reacted to concerns by putting in place measures to actively limit the administrative burden, by the way, not just on companies, but also on member states, when it regards phase-ins of the sector-specific standards under CSRD, for instance, or the reducing the number of companies under the scope. And all in all, we consider that how it is now enforced is definitely proportionate and assumable, and even makes life easier for leaders that don't have to choose between competing voluntary standards by providing one authoritative standard based on this existing best practice. And to help in implementation, not as an alternative, guidelines are key and are being developed. So EFRAG, the standard setter that provided the Commission with drafts for the reporting standards under CSRD, they are working on a series of implementation guidance documents in close contact with stakeholders, having received innumerable inputs, and thereby working towards this joint objective of having reliable data that helps both pursue public goods in terms of climate and broader sustainability in the EU and globally, but also surely a driver for business competitiveness, as leaders are showing in practice, and also in terms of their supportive reactions to this framework. And indeed, the keyword was at the beginning, implementation. So that's what it will be about for further delegated acts on the Commission side for climate policy, on company sides, and then for stakeholders and think tanks to follow, and also surely play the accountability role of ensuring that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And as Hiba was had to log off early, we have about 10 minutes left. Adeline has indicated she'd like to make one final introduction, but in the name of fairness, I will then ask that if any of our other speakers also would like to come in, please just indicate to me, raise your hand, but ask that you keep it very brief so we can stay within the time. Thank you.
Thanks for the flexibility, much appreciated. I know it's a point that I forgot to make, and that Tillman, and also echoing one of Tillman's points on there is a gap in climate and nature finance, but there is finance available out there, just not directed where we want. And also because CLG Europe is teaming up with the Women Business Coalition on a campaign called Fossil to Clean. There is, for instance, a lot of money available still globally and also in Europe to subsidize fossil fuels in a way or another. So this is an example of big pot of money that could be rechanneled to more sustainable activities and investments.
Yep. Thank you very much. Jane is nodding. No, thank you very much for that final introduction, and to all of our speakers today for this event and our audience for a very engaging conversation. I think that summarized it quite nicely, so I'll leave it at that. But thank you all again, and have a pleasant day.